it's a question of knowing that strengths exist and thinking about how we can adjust things internally and externally to play those people's strengths. Once we do that, I mean, you've found a diamond in the rough, and it's amazing to see what these people can do.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast and on your favorite social media platform. You can also find us at goodmorninghr.com. Back in January, I spoke to Nikki Drader-Meza and Dr. Jenny Lopez-Kidwell about their research into neurodiversity hiring and socialization. And then I spoke to Ron Fish about the challenges neurodiverse individuals have in applying, interviewing, and acculturating in the workplace. We return to that topic today with Dr. Matthew Zakreski, author of the Neurodiversity Playbook, How Neurodivergent People Can Crack the Code of Living in a Neurotypical World, which was released last December. Dr. Matt is a clinical psychologist who specializes in working with neurodivergent people. He is also a conference speaker and advocate for supporting neurodivergent people in all walks of life, from school to college to the workplace. And he is the co-founder of the Neurodiversity Collective, an online consulting and therapy private practice. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Matt.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So this has been a hot topic for us for about a year now. I think you're actually this is the fourth episode we've done in about a year's time on working with neurodivergent and autistic employees. And while we continue to have a talent crunch, I think more and more employers are still considering, how do we do this? But what do you think the most common misconceptions employers have when they're thinking about bringing neurodiverse employees into the workplace?
Well, and I know you've done a bunch of topics on this because I've listened to all of them. So I get to be a fan and a guest. It's the best of both worlds. So there's this idea out there that neurodivergent people are this small niche thing. It's a diversity hire. We're checking a box. Do you know 1 out of 5 people are neurodivergent? So this isn't just, oh gosh, it's the one guy in the mailroom. This is, if you have 5 people in your C-suite, odds are one of them is neurodivergent, right? Your marketing department, your sales team, your shipping department. I mean, neurodivergence is everybody's world. So that's why people like me try and get out there to talk about this, right? Because the more we talk about it, the more we realize that we are all already doing this work, but now we can do it with more intention and support more people because we know what we're doing.
So when people are talking about neurodiverse, the first thing that comes to mind for most folks are autistic individuals, people working in with that set of challenges. But you're including in that topic people like me with ADHD. And what else? What other things do we encounter in the workplace?
So ADHD, autism, dyslexia is a big one. 1 out of 10 people are dyslexic. So that's a huge number. OCD is another neurodivergence that we see a lot of. And my subspecialty is giftedness. So gifted is about 1 in 50. And giftedness is a neurodivergence that comes with significant brain differences, strengths, and weaknesses. So if you have someone who is in your office it's funny, when I consult to schools, I always ask teachers, like, do you have a kid who really pisses you off? Like, kid is like, if they could just get their shit together. And then sometimes the teachers laugh, like, yes, it's Johnny or Sally. I'm like,
Well, and that was me, but not necessarily because I was gifted. I don't know that part, but yeah, definitely that was me. Yeah, talks too often. When you had paper report cards and they would check mark the things you were not doing well. Mine was just a straight line of check marks
yeah,
every 6 weeks about talks at the appropriate times.
he will not shut up. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Well, and that's the thing, because when you have a person whose brain doesn't fit the environment we put them in, you feel more friction, right? Neurotypical brains are more able to sort of go along to get along. Neurodivergent brains are like, listen, I will fly you to the moon if it's everything I need. But if this thing's in my way, I'm just only going to be stuck on this thing that's in my way. So when I talk to HR professionals, I'm like, is there somebody in sales that you're like, if they would only get their stuff together? And they always look at each other like, oh, it's XYZ person. I'm like, here's how we tweak it to get the best version of that person, because that person is likely a neurodivergent person.
And I'm in the entrepreneurs organization. So we've got 30,000 plus entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs across the world. And there's two kinds. There's the folks who made a lot of money somehow and bought a company, but then there are people like me who just did a startup from cold scratch. And I would guess that neurodivergence is much higher in that population than just the general population, just from my own experience. And maybe maybe that helps some of us because we don't know what the challenges are going to be. We don't have the fear that we should have at the outset, things like that. But when we're talking about neurotypical, then is that just like a baseline based on the median of the population or something, and then it's like a bell curve? How does that work? What does that look like?
I mean, you nailed it, right? That's exactly what it is. And we know that about 70% of people are within one standard deviation of the mean. So that more or less tracks onto that 80% of the population that's neurotypical. And those brains are not better or worse. It's just they largely operate the way that we'd expect them to. My favorite analogy for this is height, right? So the standard height for an American man is 5'9", right? That's your average median height. So I'm 6 foot. So I'm about one standard deviation above the mean, but still well within normal bounds, right?
Hmm.
My college roommate, who's 6'9", is
Oh, wow.
quantifiably different than me. I'm like, "Sup, Adam?" He's like, "Hey, what's going on down there?" Right? And Adam needs different things. He needs to shop at different stores. When he was a groomsman in my wedding, he couldn't go to Men's Warehouse. He had to go to the special store, right? Because he's 6'9", and the world doesn't easily have things that exist for people with those extreme needs. And and this is where we get into the question of neurodivergence as equity. Because I don't need Men's Warehouse to stack items for a guy who's 6'9" or even taller. That's not a good business model for them. But the specialty operations that exist do need to exist to meet the needs of these people because their needs are real.
And so a lot of employers, when they see the equivalent of a 6'9", potential employee, but it's just in how a person thinks, behaves, interacts with other people, they see that, I guess, as a deficit that will, and they start, I guess, projecting the challenges into the relationships. What challenges do you think employers often have that are, often either misguided or incorrect or easily correctable?
And thank you for asking the question that way. What we often tell people in my line of work is search for strengths, don't be a deficit detective. It is
Hmm.
so easy to look at the neurodivergent person and be like, this is person that I'm never going to be able to bring to a corporate event. They're not polished enough. They're not social enough. They're just weird. They're atypical. And then once you have that, when that foot is in the door, everything else you see is like, it's just not worth it. But if you put that person in a position to play to their strengths are as high, if not higher, than other people. So one of the autistic clients I work with, he's a chief of operations for the executive vice president of this big company. So he's essentially the chief of staff. And he is the most equitable on top of it person. His stuff is locked down. He's got color coded charts. I've never had a color coded chart in my life. And and it's funny, like this is a very people facing job. And you wouldn't think you'd hire an autistic person to do that, but he's very good at this is what Sally needs. This is what Bryce needs. Tom is going out on a work call. He'll be gone for 10 days. Who's covering Tom's stuff? Do we have his hotel covered? It's very stepwise for him, right? So if you put this guy in sort of a traditional, like client facing role, like marketing or direct sales, he'd probably not be very successful at it, but he's got a talent for organization. He's got a brain that thinks really well from a 3,000-foot view, and he doesn't get so caught up in the office politics. He likes to joke that he's immune to it because he doesn't know what's happening. Like when people are
Mm,
whispering at the water cooler, he's like, I'm just like, listening to songs in my head. I'm like, you know what, dude, it works for you. Like lean into it.
yeah.
So it's a question of knowing that strengths exist and thinking about how we can adjust things internally and externally to play to those people's strengths. Once we do that, I mean, you've found a diamond in the rough, and it's amazing to see what these people can do.
So I'm curious because with almost every other way of slicing the population, whether it's age, race, sex, national origin, or whatever, we try actively not to make assumptions that about their behavior or their, what they believe or anything like that. At least on our best days, we try not to. But is there science that really does show that there's a high likelihood that neurodivergent people are really going to excel in some area, according to how they're wired, that really shows, that you can, if you put them in the right spot, that they're likely to achieve at a higher rate than the rest of the population? Is that giftedness that's unique to them? Is that anecdotal, or is there studies to show that?
It's both, but I'm going to focus on the quantitative research here because,
Okay.
right, this is an HR podcast. We like numbers, we like data,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
What the research shows from the Neurodiversity Employment Network is they found that their neurodivergent people, when they found an appropriate job, they tend to stay longer than the average neurotypical employee. They tend to have better performance reviews and they tend to make more money for the company when that's a money making role. So sales, something like that, right? So there are,
I'm sold.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
eh,
I own my company. I'm sold. Yeah.
count me in, right?
Uh-huh.
And to me, that's because listen, I'm a psychologist, right? I'm a bleeding heart by nature. I would love to stand on my soapbox and be like, it's the right thing to do. And it
Mhm.
it it is. It's the unemployment rates in the autistic population alone are staggering. But more than that, it's just a question of this is an untapped value resource, right? And a lot of the companies I talk to are hiring neurodivergent people because they're asking questions that the companies themselves aren't asking, right?
Mm.
Is this autistic friendly? Does this work for an ADHD person, right? And, Mike, have you ever heard, the story of the evolution of the FBI?
Not in this context. No. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Go ahead.
when they started it, they were hiring pre-law majors and lawyers from Ivy League schools. So you have a very particular slice of America, like largely affluent white men who went to Ivy League schools, which meant they were really, really good at chasing down a certain kind of crime, really good at white collar crime. They were like,
Mm.
we've got this. That guy went to the country club with my dad. I know he's had his finger in the cookie jar forever.
Yeah.
But when they started having to get into organized crime and international crime, these guys couldn't pivot. They didn't have the flexibility of worldview to like take in somebody who's, let's say, importing drugs from Central America, right? That was not a skill set they had. So the FBI had to broaden their talent pool, the people they were recruiting from, to get different skill sets, different worldviews. And I like to use this analogy a lot when I talk to businesses because if we only ever talk to the same people, we fall into an echo chamber, right? We're doing great because we all think we're doing great. So we're going to keep doing great. But if you're talking to an autistic person who's like, this app makes sense for a lot of people, but I'll never use it for this reason. 9 times out of 10, that reason is a data point in marketing that we didn't have that now we can figure out what we do with. And that's a way for your business to get a leg up.
And I've got a good friend who's probably one of the smartest guys I know and is definitely on the autism spectrum. 3 master's degrees, Albert dissertation on his PhD, and he's a valet overnight at a nice fancy hotel here because it allows him to read all night and pursue what I mean, he's got and he's perfectly content with that. And I'm glad because I learn so much every time we have a meal together from whatever he's reading. But his expectations, are different than what I think most people our age are for what he wants out of his career and his life. And so I think that's probably one of the challenges that employers have is not only how do I plug this person into a role that's appropriate to them, how do I incentivize them? What would you tell an employer about how to incentivize someone who maybe has a value system that's so foreign to your experience that that you can't, you just don't understand it.
So I'll tell a story from when I was in grad school. So I met my wife on the first day of grad school. I am very extroverted, in case that's not abundantly clear, and my wife is very introverted. And we were doing some research for one of our professors, and he's like, "You guys crushed it. You coded all this data. I'm so proud of you." He's like, "I want to take you guys out to dinner." And I'm like, "Yay!" And my wife's like, "For social contact with someone I don't know." So he looks at her, he goes, "Or can I just let you go home early today?" And I swear to God, my wife is gonna burst into tears, right? Like, yes, that's everything I've ever wanted. I've had enough people for today. So so he took me out to dinner. We had a great time. My wife went home and watched reruns of Glee. She had a great time. So when we think about our traditional carrots in the business marketplace, like happy hours, pizza parties, overnight work trips, for some people, not just neurodivergent people, but that's our topic for today. For a lot of neurodivergent people, those things are not motivators. In fact, they're actually punishers, right? I don't want to have to go to the happy hour. I would rather just go home early or not have to go to the holiday party or whatever the thing might be. And that to me, yeah, one of my guys, he won the like a chairman's award for service in his IT thing. He's like, "You know what I want as my prize? To not have to go to the ceremony."
Mm.
So they sent him a gift certificate for the amount that the dinner would have been worth. He went out to dinner by himself. He was happy as a clam. Like he sat in the
There
corner
you go.
booth, he brought a book and he ordered himself a nice steak. And honestly, who does it hurt? I don't think it hurts anybody. It's getting our own egos out of the way as leadership to say, you know what? If this works for Mike, then let's customize what we're doing in a way that it benefits Mike. That isn't about what I thought was a good idea.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. On Thursday, March 20th, I'm hosting a webinar entitled Alt Control Deceive, Protecting Yourself from Remote Employee Fraud. While many employers recognize the advantages of remote work in attracting and retaining employees, most are unaware of, much less protected from, the risk of illegal activity and fraud unique to the remote environment. Foreign actors like North Korea, fraudulent employment verifiers, and dishonest overemployed workers are but a few of the sources of liability, data breaches, and financial loss employers have suffered. Using traditional deception methods and modern artificial intelligence tools like deepfakes, bad actors are targeting unsuspecting employers. In this 1-hour webinar, I'll discuss some of the ways that dishonest actors have harmed employers and practical steps employers can take to protect themselves. And just like this podcast, the webinar is free and pre-approved for recertification credit. You can register or watch the recording later by clicking on the Education tab at imperativeinfo.com, where you can also find all my previously recorded webinars. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Recert Credits. Then select episode 191 and enter the keyword Playbook. That's PLAYBOOK. And now back to my conversation with Matt Zakreski. In the book, you talk about maybe the expectation or at least the practice that some neurodiverse people just need to mask their behavior. Talk about what masking is and how it presents in the workplace and how employers can avoid setting up that scenario.
So masking is what people do when they don't feel safe or comfortable to be themselves. So, if you think back, Mike, I don't know if you're partnered, right? But if you,
Yes.
when you,
To a very patient woman for 28 years now. Yeah. Who is also could have been your wife's sister because I'm the extrovert and she's the introvert. She will go to one event with me a week if I'm lucky, and then she just sends me on my way all the other nights. Yeah.
I was going to say, I was like, I feel like our wives would probably have a lot to talk about. But think back to the first time you met your wife's family, right? Were you the free and loose, like cracking jokes version of Mike, or were you buttoned up? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I'd love a cup of
Exactly.
coffee. Thank you very much. Like
Yes.
that is a version of masking, right? You are putting on a very particular face or set of behaviors to navigate a particularly stressful moment. But neurodivergent people have to do that almost all the time because the world isn't built for us. So if you're dyslexic and you go out to a business dinner, you may not be able to read the menu, right? One of my dyslexic adults that I work with, he always orders the special because it's said to him verbally, right? They're like, ah, yes, we have,
That's what I do. That's what I do in foreign countries too. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
right?
I've never heard of any of this food, so I'll just trust whatever they got on special. Yeah.
You look like you know what you're doing. I'm gonna roll the
Yeah.
dice on that. I did that once in Thailand and got the worst food poisoning I've ever had in my life. But
Oh my.
yeah, usually it works out for me. But that's a little accommodation he gives himself, and he's like, I also often pick up the check because it's hard for me to read the tiny little print on the long receipt. What did I order? Who got what? You know what? It's fine. I'll just put my credit card down. And he's a
Mhm.
very genial guy. People like him. It fits his business model. But it's like you think about all the little paper cuts that is, right? All those little indignities. It adds up over time. So we want to create worlds where people understand that there are times where we need to put on the best, most professional versions of ourselves, but also create environments that people can be comfortable and aligned with their best versions of themselves. Like if one of your neurodivergent people has sensory needs and we can deal with that by putting a door on their office, whereas everybody else has an open floor plan. I'm telling you, whatever it costs you, what, $300 to put a door in, it'll pay for itself 1,000 times over.
No, I'll try to do it myself first. So it'll cost me 700 because somebody's got to come back and fix all my screw ups too. But yeah,
How did you set it on fire? There was no fire
exactly.
involved. Yeah, see, I don't touch that stuff. I got a guy for it. I'm gonna call my guy, right? But that's the thing. Like those little things go a long way to not only incentivizing behavior, but creating an environment where it can thrive. Because, as we say often in my line of work, if the flower's not growing, you don't blame the flower, you change the greenhouse. It
Mm.
is so much easier to change the greenhouse than buy a new flower.
And so that masking is, I mean, you're the psychologist here, but that masking is probably the same or very similar to what we talk about when we're talking about cultural differences and code switching. It's the same kind of thing. And we've had a conversation here in the past about code switching and the need that people from, different, backgrounds than the majority background, feel that they have, the need to speak very differently and to present themselves differently. But there are times where we need that the social expectations or the social norms inside of an organization are there for a reason. How do we help someone who's neurodiverse adapt successfully where those social norms need to happen in a certain way within some range of error, I guess?
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny you mentioned code switching. That's actually like that's the conclusion of my book is that it's not about cracking the code, it's being able to switch into it and switch out of it, right? If the CEO is coming to my table at work, yes, you better believe I'm gonna be the most neurotypical person you've ever met. Hello, Mr. CEO. How are you today,
Mhm.
sir? How about local sports team and weather? Right? And then I'll just
Right.
be like, look at me, I'm doing a good neurotypical. And then I will probably take myself out to lunch and like play Pokemon Go as I eat my burger and I'm fine. Right? It's knowing the wheres and whens. The the biggest thing for the reality of sometimes we do need to mask, right? Is making that stuff overt, intentional, and visible. So the biggest problem we run into in corporate culture for neurodivergent folks are the unwritten rules, right?
Hmm.
And I I've I mean, I think
What we call common sense sometimes. Yeah.
and
Okay.
and it's common sense because 80% of the population is neurotypical and they largely speak the same language. Their brains work very similarly. So I can say to a neurotypical person, the boss is coming today. They're like, I'm going to put on my best suit. I say that to a neurodivergent person whose brain doesn't work that way. And they're like, oh, cool. We must be doing well as a company. Like, that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. You're not making the same leap, though. So everybody else looks like fresh out of like, GQ magazine. And I'm wearing my favorite work coding t shirt and I'm destroying code today. I'm killing it. But the CEO comes in like, who's this unkempt dude? And I'm like, I'm your best coder, sir. All
Mhm.
right. you know, so when there are cultural norms that need to be accounted for, we make the unspoken things spoken, right? We say, hey, here's exactly what I expect from you in this situation. Here's what to do, and here's what not to do. And taking the extra 5 minutes to name those things for your neurodivergent employees, they'll follow the rules forever. They just need to know what they are.
And companies want to bring in diverse people for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that we've really found in the last 5 years is tokenism doesn't work. It's not a good business plan. It's not fair to the employees you're bringing in. And it certainly you don't want to set the culture where people assume that somebody who has whatever traits are there because of those traits rather than their ability to perform the role. How can an employer avoid tokenism when they're actively trying to bring in, attract, and retain neurodivergent employees?
So this is when we get into the idea of what we call universal design. So the best practices that accommodate the most people are just the best practices, right? So if your company is up 4 stairs from the parking lot, let us bulldoze those stairs and put in a ramp because everybody can get up a ramp, right? Not just the person, not just the able-bodied people, right?
Sure.
And that could be someone who sprains their ankle playing basketball or somebody who, took a spill on the ice or a million other things, right? But ramps, everybody can get in a ramp, and if you have a company where you can work from home as long as you let your team leader know, then we're not highlighting the neurodivergent folks who can't be around other people all the time. It's, Stella from HR or Mike you know, from the C-suite or Tony, your autistic IT specialist. They all can work from home when they need to because life happens, right? It isn't just a specific thing for specific people because one of the mental health challenges we see a lot in retaining neurodivergent people is the concept of imposter syndrome, right? The idea is that if you have a thing that makes you different and you are made aware of that difference in overt ways and in subtle ways, it fuels that idea of imposter syndrome, right? If everybody else in the company went to state U and you went to tech, that's enough for your brain to go, maybe they only hired me because they needed somebody from tech. And that's not necessarily true, but once that anxiety worms its way in there, it can become very insidious and it can like honestly sabotage the employee from the inside out. So we make universal design as many things as possible. We also create identity groups or leadership groups within your company. Most companies use the ERG model, right? Employee resource groups, right? And I've consulted to probably somewhere around a dozen of those in some pretty big companies just to say, like, here's what we're doing. Here's how to avoid that tokenism. Let's make actionable advice. Let's have things that people need. For a lot of ERGs for neurodivergent people, they may not actually need to meet that often. They just might need to have a database where you can go and find the thing you need, right? Here's how to talk to HR about getting your leave approved, rather than like, does anybody have any questions in our meeting where there's pizza? Because that doesn't necessarily work, right? So we're having internal staffing that becomes that sort of beacon that allows neurodivergent people to go to their people. You're using universal design to lower the barrier to entry for every single person in your company. And then the third thing is be overt in your messaging, right? Be overt in the way that we are here trying to make things accessible for every person who works here. And because with other kinds of diversity, someone in a wheelchair, someone of a different nationality, someone of a different skin color, those things are not easily hidden, right? If you have an employee who wears a hijab, like they're not gonna hide that,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
But neurodivergence can be an invisible disability, right? I mean, you mentioned before you have ADHD. I have ADHD as well. I don't know if anybody would know by talking to us, right? But if they left us alone in a waiting room and then they come back in and we were doing like, battle bots with pencils and markers, they're like, "Oh, now it's
Yeah.
abundantly
That
clear,"
makes sense.
right?
Right. Yeah.
You know, so it becomes this thing where just make your learning process as a company transparent. Say like, "Hey, we don't have all the answers, but we're taking these steps for these reasons and we want to know more." And and I think when that kind of I'm fond of saying that neurodivergent people are allergic to bullshit, right?
Mm,
You can't,
I can see that.
right?
Yeah.
You can't lie to us. Like, we'll run through a brick wall for you if we know why we're running through the brick wall. So it's like, listen, I'm not gonna sit here and say I have all the answers, right? That intellectual humility means, oh man, this guy's not bullshitting me. That's awesome. I want on board with this. I want to build this co-created benefit from their growth curve because then everybody in that company knows that it's a living document, not like the 10 commandments handed down from God, right? And when people know that they're a part of something that's growing and evolving, they invest more into it and they get more from it. So it's sort of a win-win.
Interesting. To wrap up, so what do I do with all my neurotypical people? I mean, how do I get them ready to not make this a thing that gets in the way of how, because we've all worked with neurotypical people who have very strong beliefs about how the way things ought to be. And when somebody acts outside, colors outside of those lines, it makes, it gives them some grief. And so how do you prepare your neurotypical employees for, especially those more rigid or, who knows, have their own, neurodiversity of their, it may be a neurodiverse population, all of it to themselves. But how do you prepare them to work in this different environment where they maybe have people who aren't thinking, behaving the way they expect?
So I often call this the supervillain test. So if I'm Chuck in sales and I'm neurotypical and I've done things this way my whole life, I was a business major, I get how this works. And then we hire Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is ADHD and dyslexic, and she goes about it in an entirely different way. She takes her clients out to coffee. She's always like sending like little notes, and you're like, that's not about the business relationship where it's all about the bottom line. And so if they come and talk to the manager, I would say, so we know that this person is atypical. They're doing things a different way. Now, do you think I'm good at my job? And the person's like, "Well, of course, we've been working together for years." It's like, "So here's the deal. Either I have a good reason for hiring this person because of their atypicality, so we need to trust me, or I'm a supervillain and I'm trying to screw with your career." Right? And it's what it does is it anticipates the emotional argument from the employee and it sort of short circuits it. It's like, I don't like it, I don't get it, but I also know you're not a supervillain, right? So it builds a nice framework, a nice barrier around that conversation,
That's great.
you know.
Yeah.
And if I can throw one more piece of advice out there, it's good practice for all of us to be very intentional in our language. So we take a lot of shortcuts. And when we speak, like I might say, "Oh, hey, Mike, go get the thing." And I know what the thing is. Mike, do you know what the thing is?
I have no
You have no
idea.
idea. So I'm going to get mad at you for not getting the thing that you don't know what the thing was in the first place. Right. And I do this in my parenting workshops all the time. And I cannot tell you how many HR professionals and business managers come up to me like, I need to do this at the office. I'm like, yes, you do. Right. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Right. So if, if I'm using a turn of phrase that's like, actually, this is a very adorable example. One of my gifted employees, he works for a pretty big real estate firm. He was talking to somebody who'd just been transferred into the office, and he's like, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" He's working on small talk. We're very proud of him. And the guy's like, "Oh, man, one day closer to death." Right? One of those things that you say, and it's like, it's a little bit gallows humor. It's a little bit life is hard. I get it. I'm here for it. My client, who's very sincere and takes most things at very face value, he called HR. He's like, "I'm worried about the new hire." He said he's one day closer to death. Can you make him a psych referral? And it's so sweet, right? And so this guy was like, "Well, I didn't know. I mean, I'm not suicidal. Everything's fine." Uh, but they invited me to be a part of this debrief, and I'm like, "So here's how this came across to this guy. So in the future, you might say something like, 'I'm having a tough day,' or like, things are hard, but I'm doing okay." Like, you don't owe him that, but it makes everybody's life easier if you can just be very intentional with what you say. And to this guy's great credit, he took it with grace, he took it with humility, he found the humor in it. He's like, "Man, I gotta be careful in what I say." I was like, That's also a good lesson here."
Yeah.
And that just like, all those little idioms, all those little shortcuts we use with our language, it's built by the monoculture. The monoculture is a neurotypical culture. So I might say to one of my more concrete employees, like, "I need to talk to you later. Everything's fine. I'm talking to you about your sales goals." I'm going to use that extra language, what we call meta communication, to build the structure around that in a way that sort of limits the emotional flailing that may occur.
Dr. Matthew Zakreski is author of the Neurodiversity Playbook, How Neurodivergent People Can Crack the Code of Living in a Neurotypical World. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Matt.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You'll find links to Matt's book and other resources in the show notes. And thank you for listening. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. It helps other people find us, as does sharing the episode on your favorite social media platform. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm the very ADHD Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.